You think your thoughts are your own, that your opinions, reactions, and beliefs are the result of your experiences, your education, your judgment. But what if they're not? What if they were installed? Carl Jung warned us that most people are not individuals. They are collections of borrowed voices, conditioned reactions, cultural assumptions. He called it psychic infection, the silent takeover of the mind by forces we no longer notice. And the terrifying part is, it doesn't feel like possession. It feels like you. That's the trick. Every day, you scroll, speak, and decide. But who's really behind the wheel? The outrage that rises when you read a headline, the loyalty you feel toward a group, a flag, a cause, the instant rejection of certain ideas before you've even thought them through. These aren't random. They've been shaped. Mass media, political systems, ideology, education, entertainment. Jung saw that modern civilization wasn't just shaping behavior, it was colonizing consciousness. And it wasn't doing it through violence or fear, but through symbols, language, repetition, belonging. You were never asked what you believed. You were trained. Jung believed this was more dangerous than any dictator, because the invasion of the mind is invisible. A man possessed by collective thought doesn't know he's been taken. He thinks he's enlightened, moral, informed. But listen closely, and he only repeats what he's been given. We tell ourselves we're individuals, but look around. The same phrases, the same anger, the same patterns of thought echoing through different mouths. The illusion of choice, propped up by curated identities and algorithmic reinforcement. Dissent is allowed, as long as it stays within acceptable boundaries. And that's where Jung's warning turns lethal. Because once a society replaces thought with ideology, individuals become fragments of a larger machine. They behave like cells in a hive. They police themselves. They attack any signal of nonconformity. They become useful and disposable. So if you've ever felt a strange disconnect, like you're living a script you didn't write, it's not your imagination. It's a symptom. Something has entered, and the longer it goes unexamined, the deeper it burrows in. But the most dangerous part of the illusion was still to come. Because once your thoughts are no longer your own, the next step is more subtle, but more profound. The infection spreads into the symbols you live by, the myths you never chose. Jung warned that beneath every belief system, every political ideology, every cultural movement, there are archetypes, not invented ideas, but ancient patterns embedded in the psyche. The hero, the savior, the outcast, the enemy. They aren't metaphors, they're instincts, psychic reflexes that shape the way we see the world. And once someone learns how to activate them, control no longer looks like control. It looks like inspiration. A politician doesn't need facts. He needs to resemble the father. A movement doesn't need truth. It needs the shape of a story, with victims to rescue and villains to destroy. Archetypes bypass reason. They speak directly to the unconscious. And when triggered, they don't feel like manipulation. They feel like destiny. This is how mass persuasion works. Not with logic, but with mythology. Repackaged for the modern world. Campaigns that echo the call of the hero. Products that whisper transformation. Ideologies that offer redemption or righteous battle. All using ancient psychological blueprints to direct collective behavior. Jung saw this as deeply dangerous. Not because archetypes are evil, but because they're powerful. And when they're hijacked by systems, political, economic, cultural, they shape people without their awareness. You feel conviction, purpose, even love, for something you never really understood. The individual becomes a role, a mask, a vessel for forces that were never truly personal. And the longer you live this way, the more your mind becomes terrain, a battlefield where symbols fight for dominance. Not your symbols, theirs, the ones fed to you in headlines, films, slogans, posts. You absorb the imagery, the language, the structure, and slowly your internal world becomes theirs. Jung warned that when this happens, the person is no longer individuating. They're being possessed, not by spirits, but by systems. You don't evolve. You conform. You don't think. You act out a script. You become predictable, programmable, hollow. And it doesn't feel like defeat. It feels like identity. Because when the crowd hands you a mask that fits, it's easy to forget you ever had a face. The individual begins to disappear, and something else takes its place. A figure that looks like a person, speaks like a person, argues, votes, shouts, and obeys. But the core is hollow. Jung saw this transformation again and again in the 20th century. The rise of mass ideologies, the loss of personal conscience, the merging of the self with the crowd. He called it identification with the collective psyche, the moment a person stops being I and becomes we. It feels powerful, it feels righteous, but it is the beginning of psychological death. You don't need to think anymore because the group thinks for you. You don't need to ask questions because the narrative is already written. You just have to believe harder, shout louder, and punish anyone who strays from the path. And the more you do it, the more secure you feel. Not because you're strong, but because you're hidden. This is the great seduction of collectivism. It promises safety from the unbearable weight of being yourself. But Jung warned that whenever the self dissolves into the group, the unconscious takes over. The rational mind fades, and instinct, especially fear and aggression, rises. It's not evolution, it's regression. You become tribal, you become primitive, you become dangerous. Look at history. Look at the flags raised, the books burned, the hands saluted in unison. Every time it begins the same way, with the idea that the group is more important than the individual, that loyalty is more virtuous than doubt, that morality can be outsourced to whatever doctrine happens to be in power. Jung saw this with terrifying clarity in Nazi Germany. A civilized nation full of thinkers, artists, philosophers, turned into a single shrieking mouth. Not because people were monsters, but because they stopped being people. They fused with something larger, something older, something unconscious. And once that happens, evil no longer looks like evil. It looks like duty. It looks like progress. It looks like destiny. And we're not immune. The tools are different now. Digital instead of militaristic, cultural instead of political, but the dynamic is the same. Mass outrage, mass loyalty, mass fear, and beneath it all, the slow erosion of the individual voice, the inner conscience, the quiet voice that says, this doesn't feel right. But if that voice is ignored long enough, it dies. And when it dies, the man walking around in your skin may still look like you, but he no longer belongs to himself. Because once you've handed over your thinking, you don't get to decide who uses it next. Because once you've handed over your thinking, you've also handed over your shadow, the part of yourself you refuse to see. Jung believed that every individual carries a shadow. All the traits, desires, and fears the conscious ego refuses to acknowledge. Not evil in themselves, but dangerous when denied. And when a society denies its collective shadow, it doesn't disappear. It festers. Repressed qualities don't vanish. They project. What you refuse to see in yourself, you will find and fight in others. And so, a man convinced of his moral purity will begin to see monsters everywhere. A culture that cannot admit its own aggression will become obsessed with policing aggression in others. This is not moral progress, it's mass psychosis. Jung warned that the more we deny the shadow, the more we become possessed by it. Entire groups begin acting out the very evil they claim to be fighting, and because they cannot see it in themselves, they believe they are righteous. They feel noble as they humiliate. They feel courageous as they conform. They feel compassionate as they destroy. This is why modern culture feels so unstable, not because we're confronting our darkness, but because we're denying it while projecting it onto everyone else. Jung saw this as the recipe for collective madness, the refusal to introspect, the demand that all evil exists out there, that someone else is to blame, always someone else. But the shadow doesn't go away just because we ignore it. It grows more chaotic, more dangerous, more seductive. If unacknowledged long enough, it erupts in cruelty disguised as justice, in censorship disguised as safety, in vengeance disguised as virtue. You've seen it, maybe you've even felt it, that rush of righteousness that feels clean and purposeful, but somehow leaves you emptier each time. Jung didn't say this to condemn us. He said it because he knew the only real revolution is internal. You cannot reform the world if you are possessed by the very forces you seek to eliminate. You cannot speak of justice while disowning your capacity for injustice, and you cannot be free while pretending you have no darkness. Modern man, Jung believed, is terrified of his own shadow. That's why we cling to curated identities, ethical, enlightened, progressive, and flee from anything that threatens that image. But this flight from inner truth is exactly what makes us manipulable. We become hollow, performative, easy to steer, because a man who cannot confront his own evil will never notice when evil borrows his voice, because a man who cannot confront his own evil will never notice when evil borrows his voice, and it speaks softly, with familiar words. Jung understood that language is not neutral. Words are symbols, soaked in emotion, shaped by culture, and used, often deliberately, to obscure more than they reveal. He believed that once a word becomes ideological, it stops meaning what it meant and starts functioning as a spell. That's how people lose the ability to think clearly, not because they're stupid, but because the language itself has been corrupted. Certain words become untouchable. Freedom, justice, equality, hate, progress. Say them and heads nod. Question them and you're a threat. But what do they actually mean? Most people don't know. They just know how to react to them. This is what Jung feared, that speech would stop being a tool for expressing thought and instead become a ritual of allegiance. Repeat the right words and you're safe. Doubt them and you're marked. You don't have to understand what you're saying. You only have to say it. Like a child repeating a prayer he doesn't grasp, or a citizen reciting a pledge he never wrote. And once speech is hollow, thought follows. Because language isn't just how we communicate, it's how we think. If your words are preloaded with someone else's definitions, someone else's values, someone else's emotions, then your thoughts are no longer yours. You are thinking within a cage, and the worst part is, the cage looks like truth. This is how ideologies maintain control. They create a moral vocabulary that feels obvious and universal, but it's neither. It's engineered. It's crafted to trap nuance, prevent doubt, and punish deviation. And because it lives in your language, it feels like it lives in your conscience. Have you noticed how certain phrases kill conversations? That's offensive. That's harmful. That's problematic. They don't explain. They don't explore. They end. That's the point. They function like shutdown commands, signals that the boundary of acceptable thought has been reached. No further. Jung would call this a spiritual sickness, because when language no longer reflects the complexity of the soul withers. When you speak only to conform, or to defend yourself, or to signal the right beliefs, you stop speaking from within. You stop asking the dangerous questions. And without dangerous questions, there can be no truth. So we begin to live in slogans, speak in hashtags, argue with memes. Our mouths move, but our minds stay silent. And somewhere deep beneath the noise, the real self begins to fade. Not in a scream, but in the quiet death of words no longer spoken. And as words lose meaning, so do dreams. Jung believed that dreams were the language of the unconscious, the raw, unfiltered truth of what the psyche knows, but the ego refuses to face. In dreams, the real you speaks. Not the persona you show the world, not the opinions you've absorbed, but the unguarded self, the symbolic self, the one that still remembers what it means to be alive. But what happens when even your dreams aren't your own? The modern world doesn't just want your time, your money, your attention. It wants your inner life. Advertising doesn't stop when the screen turns off. Propaganda doesn't wait for your consent. These forces crawl into the imagination, shaping the content of your fantasies, the texture of your desires. Jung would have seen this not as progress, but as possession, a psychic hijacking of the soul's most private space. Think about the images that surface when you close your eyes, the ambitions, the fears, the ideals. Are they truly yours? Or are they the echo of 1,000 ads, 1,000 curated influencers, 1,000 algorithmically selected messages telling you what to want, who to be, what to fear? The unconscious cannot speak plainly. It speaks in symbols. But if those symbols are constantly overwritten by media, politics, and culture, the unconscious begins to speak in someone else's voice. It's no longer your soul communicating. It's the system reflecting itself back to you. This is why Jung insisted that individuation, the process of becoming fully oneself, required retreat. Not escape, but withdrawal. A stepping back from the flood of collective noise. Not because the world is evil, but because it's too loud to hear anything else. Especially the whisper of your own mind. But very few people do this. Most don't even know it's an option. They fill their minds with a constant input, news, content, music, podcasts, commentary, until the silence inside them is gone, not feared, forgotten. And when silence is gone, the capacity for reflection dies with it. Jung didn't think technology was the enemy. He believed unconsciousness was. And in a world that never turns off, unconsciousness becomes default. We dream about luxury because we're told it means success. We fantasize about revenge because we're taught that suffering gives us moral power. We long for connection, but only in the forms we've seen repeated, in romance arcs, in viral videos, in scripted storylines that were never written for us. And all the while, we call this free will. But what do you call it when even your dreams obey? Jung would call it a failure of the self, the moment when the persona becomes the master, not the mask. In his view, the persona was necessary. We all need a way to function in society, to play roles, to adapt, but the danger comes when we forget that the persona is a performance, when we start believing it's who we are. And in the modern world, that danger is everywhere. We no longer wear masks just to blend in. We curate them, optimize them, perform them for audiences. The persona has become a product, and the more you polish it, the more attention you receive. Likes, applause, praise, validation. But the real self, it atrophies, buried under performance, starved of truth. Jung warned that when the persona grows too powerful, the inner life collapses. You become a character, designed for consumption. Your words are edited. Your values are rehearsed. Even your vulnerability becomes aesthetic, packaged, shared, monetized. It feels real, but it's hollow, because it's not you. It's a simulation of who you think you should be. And the worst part, you forget there ever was a difference. This is the paradox of modern identity. The more connected we become, the less authentic we feel. The more visible, the more invisible we become to ourselves. We trade complexity for clarity, depth for performance. And somewhere in the midst of all the posting, all the proving, all the pretending, we lose the ability to ask the only question that matters. Who is underneath all of this? Jung saw this as the central crisis of the modern psyche. Not trauma, not repression, but falseness. The epidemic of people living lives they don't understand, chasing dreams they didn't choose, embodying roles that quietly kill them, not because they're weak, but because they're terrified. Terrified of what might be revealed if the mask came off. So the mask stays on, smiling, achieving, performing. And inside, the soul drifts further from the surface. It still speaks, in anxiety, in nightmares, in sudden moments of dread that seem to come from nowhere. But those signals are buried, ignored, medicated, because the performance must go on. And we tell ourselves we're being authentic, even as we rehearse our next line. We tell ourselves we're thinking freely, even as we repeat the script. But deep down, there's a quiet ache, a sense that something real is missing. Not because it's gone, but because we've stopped listening. And the more convincing the mask becomes, the harder it is to know we're wearing one at all. And once you forget you're wearing a mask, the crowd takes over. Slowly, invisibly, your thoughts begin to mirror those around you. Your emotions rise and fall in sync with the collective mood. What the crowd believes, you believe. Not because it makes sense, but because to disagree would make you alone. And modern man is terrified of being alone. Jung believed the crowd was not just a social phenomenon. It was a psychological possession. The group mind is ancient, primal, irrational. Once you're in it, something shifts. Your individuality shrinks. Your responsibility dissolves. Your inner compass is silenced. The crowd becomes the source of truth, of morality, of identity. And even if you suspect it's wrong, you stay quiet, because to speak out is to be cast out. This is not theoretical. You see it every day, in comment sections, in trending hashtags, in moral crusades and viral shaming. The language is always the same: urgent, righteous, absolute. And the people caught in it believe they're thinking, but they're not. They're reacting. They're echoing. They're being moved, not moving themselves. Jung warned that crowds don't think. They act. They feel. They consume. They punish. And when the individual surrenders to the group, the conscience is replaced by momentum. You do what others are doing, and you feel safe doing it. Because if everyone's doing it, it must be right? But this is the psychology of every dark chapter in human history. Genocide, war, purges, book burnings, not committed by monsters, but by ordinary people who merged with something larger than themselves, who silenced their doubt to feel belonging, who mistook conformity for morality. And today, the crowd isn't just in the streets, it's in your pocket. It speaks through your feed. It watches how you speak, what you share, what you like. It rewards obedience and punishes deviation. And slowly, if you're not careful, It teaches you how to exist. So you begin to censor yourself. You say what you're supposed to say. You like what you're supposed to like. Not out of fear, exactly, but out of fatigue. Because resisting the crowd requires energy, and most people don't have enough of it left. Jung believed the only antidote to crowd possession was solitude. Not loneliness, but psychological distance. Time with your own thoughts. Time to remember what you believe, not what you were told to believe. But solitude is scarce now. Distracted minds can't be alone. They crave the next hit of outrage, the next wave of collective emotion, the next invitation to dissolve the self. And the longer you live like this, the more the crowd lives in you. Until one day, you open your mouth and realize you're not the one speaking. Until one day, you open your mouth and realize you're not the one speaking. And in that moment of awareness, if it ever comes, you're faced with a terrifying choice: remain asleep in comfort or begin the brutal work of waking up. Jung never promised this path would be easy. He called it individuation, the slow, painful, often isolating journey of reclaiming your mind, your soul, yourself. Most people will never take it, because individuation doesn't make you popular. It doesn't make you rich. It doesn't make you safe. It strips away every mask you've learned to wear. It forces you to confront your contradictions, your capacity for cruelty, your hidden desires, your unexamined fears. It asks you to stand alone, not defiantly, but honestly, without the slogans, without the applause, without the armor. And that's what makes it sacred. Individuation is not self-improvement. It's not branding yourself as authentic or mindful or enlightened. Those are just new personas, repackaged for a marketplace that sells identities like shoes. True individuation is raw. It's humiliating. It breaks the illusion that you are good or special or correct. It reveals that you are fragmented, and that healing means facing every broken part. Jung believed that only through this process could a person become real. Not ideal, not perfect, real. And real people cannot be controlled. They may suffer, they may be rejected, but they cannot be possessed, because they have integrated their shadow. They have reclaimed their thoughts. They are not acting out someone else's myth. They are writing their own. But this is rare, because the world doesn't want real people. It wants roles. It wants function. It wants predictability. And individuation creates wild cards. People who won't play the game, who speak uncomfortable truths, who don't belong anywhere because they belong to themselves. Jung understood that this path would be lonely. That's why he spoke so often of the danger of mass movements, the seduction of systems, the hunger for belonging. These are the temptations that pull the individual back into the collective, back into the comfort of thoughtless certainty. And if you fall for them, you will be praised. You will be embraced. You will be given a mask, and you will forget you ever took it off. But if you resist, truly resist, you begin to hear something else. Not louder than the crowd, but deeper. A voice not of ideology, but of insight. Not of outrage, but of honesty. It doesn't scream. It doesn't sell. It just speaks. And it has been waiting for you for a very long time. But to hear it, you have to be willing to lose everything that isn't yours. But to hear it, you have to be willing to lose everything that isn't yours. And that's when the real shock sets in. Because once you begin pulling at the threads, you see how far the stitching goes, how deeply your mind has been shaped, not just by society, but by centuries of inherited symbols, by unspoken expectations, by fears you never chose but still obey. Jung believed we live in a web of invisible forces: family myths, religious echoes, cultural guilt, collective memory. And while we imagine ourselves as isolated thinkers, we are more often vessels, filled, emptied, refilled by ideas that passed through us long before we had the power to examine them. You were never alone in your head. From childhood, you were taught what to value, what to fear, what success looks like, what failure means. Every story told to you by parents, teachers, screens, systems left an imprint, and those imprints don't disappear. They layer, they deepen, they form the internal scaffolding that holds your identity together. But if the structure was never yours to begin with, what exactly are you building? Jung didn't blame us for this. He didn't see us as weak or broken. He saw us as asleep, trapped not by our own failures, but by the sheer complexity of modern psychic life. Too much noise, too many signals, too many forces pretending to be truth. And in the confusion, we cling to whatever feels certain, even if it enslaves us. The question isn't whether you've been programmed. You have. We all have. The question is, have you ever tried to deprogram yourself? Have you ever questioned the voice in your head? Not the loud one that judges and plans and argues, but the quiet one that whispers what you should want, what you should be. Have you ever asked where that voice came from? Because that's where the real work begins. Not in arguing with the world, but in reclaiming the territory of your own mind. Not in declaring your opinions louder, but in dismantling them slowly, carefully, honestly, until what remains is yours. And if you're lucky or cursed, you'll realize that most of what you thought was self was armor. Jung never promised resolution. He promised awareness. He believed that truth didn't liberate you from suffering. It gave the suffering meaning. And in a world that thrives on illusion, meaning is the rarest form of resistance. So if you ever feel a disturbance in your thoughts, a crack in the narrative, don't ignore it. That crack might be the first sign of something ancient waking up. Not a new opinion, not a better argument, but a deeper kind of knowing. And it's been waiting in the dark, behind every borrowed thought, for you to finally notice it was never yours.